thank you for sticking around for this panel. Actually, I was thinking, because of the last panel where it was said there's so much more interesting stuff to discuss than only finance, I would say this is about DeFi, but maybe we should talk about the D mainly, about decentralization. And of course, I'm biased because I am the founder and executive director of the European Decentralization Institute. We advocate for decentralization as a strategic foundation of Europe's digital society and economy. And we published our first policy paper just 2 weeks ago on digital sovereignty. And then from that, I was so lucky to be invited to a summit in Berlin on digital sovereignty, which actually showed how important that topic is. So if we are looking for decentralization and how it fits into policymaking, then digital sovereignty definitely is one that Europe is interested in, with even Chancellor Merz and President Macron being on the stage rooting for decentralization. Having said that, we have a very interesting panel to talk about this, to talk about DeFi, to talk about anything that is related to that, and what can we learn from other countries in that respect as well. And maybe my first question is a little bit of an open door, but I would like to ask it, and also like to ask you to introduce yourselves while answering that question, or maybe first introduce yourself and then answer that question. But the first question is, when we look at DeFi or look at decentralization, is Europe actually missing the boat? Jan.
Reinhart, thank you very much for having me on this panel. I'm an investor, and one of my portfolio companies, Ludo, I present here on the panel. And back to your question, is Europe missing the boat? I think we had a few discussions just before on that topic. We see that other people have been early. We heard about Liechtenstein. Switzerland had early DeFi regulation. The US now with the Genius Act. I think it's also a strategic discussion that Europe should have. It comes relatively early, first with regulation and then with economic growth. Most other areas have the economic growth first and then they regulate. And I think particularly because you talk about the the decentralized part, I think it's interesting to see also the Genius Act in the US, where you have, much like the banking regulation in the EU, where the ECB regulates only the large banks and national regulators regulate the smaller banks. The Genius Act in the US does the same thing. It's only the very big ones are regulated by the federal agencies, and only the smaller ones are regulated by state agencies. And I think missing the boat is also an interesting question about, we heard a lot about standardization. We've seen the Czech National Bank trying to first iron out all the differences and then opening the market. I think Europe has such a diverse the landscape of countries and traditions, and I think why not let play out the market and see which interpretation of the countries actually works best. And from those you could pick a winner. If one country really stands out and a lot of economic boom happens in one jurisdiction, maybe the others can learn from that. I think the richness of Europe is the diversity and not the standardization. And I think that is the issue. If Europe really tries to hammer home any standard, it will take forever until we've heard about civil code problems, financial regulation harmonization, tax harmonization, and whatever else. Why don't we let, with a minimal light touch regulation on the processes? I mean, if you're an asset manager, you need to have follow certain rules. If you're an exchange, you should follow certain rules. But most others, I think they should first let the market play out and then see where there is abuse or where there is a problem. And I think that is the general approach, where you try to promote growth and not regulation first. And I think is the hard part of the European discussion.
All right, thank you. Samuel?
So I believe, let's talk of what we have at the moment. So although there are a lot of bills in the US, there is no multi-comprehensive framework as of yet, like we have in MiCA in the EU. So even though the Genius Act, as mentioned, it has a DeFi carve-outs, but mostly in relation to stablecoin providers. I believe that recital 22 of MiCA, which mentions DeFi, I would say it's a very good compromise about the actual situation on the ground. So normally what we see in recitals is, or what is going to be further explained in the text, in the articles, or rather something that no one could agree about, but you put it there, like other things like the interlab between PSD2 and MiCA. But I believe in recital 22 we have a signal where if a DeFi player is truly advocating decentralized protocols and also autonomous, then it is exempt. And I believe that is a good starter. We don't need to regulate everything.
All right, we don't need a regulator. I don't know if there are any regulators still in the room, but having said that, I think that earlier today, Peter Kerstens said that when he travels the world, and I think it was Peter saying that actually, when he travels the world, he sees that Europe has all the regulation but no innovation, and the rest of the world has the innovation and no regulation. So actually, that is back to your point, maybe, both of you, where you say, well, if we look at the way that we regulate within the EU, then there seems to be a tendency to become more centralized in terms of the regulation rather than decentralized. And that might be different in other countries, like in Switzerland, for example, or like in the US. What is your comment on that?
That's interesting because that's exactly where the company Ludo comes in, where we have a fully decentralized compliance tool where there's no central authority telling you what is a good crypto project and which is a bad one. It's a decentralized users and use cases that will actually determine the trust layer that we're building on top of the infrastructure to screen all those incoming projects for the exchanges. So I think that is somewhat answering your question. The variety of local adaptations, I think, would be a much easier and faster route to success rather than trying to standardize every little detail at first. And as we heard, the complexity between tax, regulation, civil law, all that comes into play, and until you find a standardization, it will be much easier and faster to have decentralized organizations and regions trying out their version, and then the market will decide which one is the most successful.
Yeah, also the challenge with EU regulation is how long it takes. So at OKX, if you look at the DeFi trends from NFTs to meme coins, mania, or if you look at the critical technology shifts from proof of stake to proof of work to zero knowledge to optimistic outputs, proofs, they are normally measured in months, not in years. Maximum of 2 to 3 years. If you look at MiCA, it took 3 to 4 years, and then grandfathering provisions. So how do you really do a pan-European regulation on such a decentralized topic?
Yeah, exactly. And maybe for speed's sake, some form of centralization would actually help then in maybe the decision making. But I can imagine, Jan, that you are not completely in agreement to that. Because how would you see that if different member states in EU would actually all have their own regimes and let the best win? What would that look like?
You have now, as an example, you have MiCA. But now the question is, how is it implemented? We had a discussion about the interactions with the civil code and the tax code. So I think the more generic and the activity-oriented the regulation is, the more different the implementation in the countries can be. The more you try to standardize on how the companies should behave and what they need to do, the more difficult it is to first implement it into local law and then also to standardize it, because it has so many layers of complexity that comes into the regulation. So I think activity-based regulation and relatively light touch is certainly the faster one. For the systemic relevant players, just like the banks with the ECB, there of course centralization makes sense. I think it's the largest 30 banks, I'm not sure what the number exactly is these days, are regulated by the ECB because they are relevant not just for their own countries but for the whole of Europe. For every crypto player who becomes that big that it's relevant for every economy around the continent, of course it should be centralized regulation. But until we're there, there's ample time to grow for the industry.
And is there a difference, as a follow-up, and then I'll get to you, sorry, is there a difference between how Switzerland is working on this compared to the EU, and what can we learn?
You know, Switzerland has a history of being very decentralized. When we created the country in 1291, there was no central currency. So currency has never been a political power as other countries have had it, like the French franc, which was always something that the central government would wield as a force. But in Switzerland, you can pay your taxes in bitcoins and file your annual accounts in English. You know, and certain cantons allow that, and others don't, and that's fine. And we learn from one another, and other cantons can adopt or don't have to. It tends to be those cantons who have more financial or industrial backgrounds that are more innovative or more interested, and more rural countries who've maybe less of an interest, but not always, but in many cases. So that's fine. Then you have 2, 3, 4 versions of a market, and you see which one plays out. And in the end, the market will go there where the conditions are best.
Samuel, what is your take on this?
So, I'm a convinced European. I tend to believe that proportionality and subsidiarity are still European values. So I believe what he just said, and I believe that in a case where we have DeFi, creating regulatory sandboxes at national level, there has to be trust between regulators. So if you have a player who've acted well, in line with European values, in line with principles which we consider as essential to survive in the financial system, the European financial system, for a given number of years, then that player can also access other markets in Europe, so can access on a pan-European basis. And this is in particular for DeFi, because MiCA comes when you have CeFi, which has achieved a certain level. DeFi is still quite small and large at the same time. So I believe that we should have an open dialogue where all national regulators invite DeFi players and really have this dialogue, not impose regulation by certain regulators that may not necessarily also understand all the implications.
Okay, thank you. By the way, if there are any, we're still with a small group, so if there are any questions from the audience, just raise your hand and you will be given the floor. So let's not wait until the end of the panel. If you have a burning question, then please raise your hand. I don't see any. I would like to switch to digital sovereignty. I mean, I alluded a little bit to it in the beginning. And Europe talks a lot about it these days. But practically, really, what would it take to build a DeFi ecosystem on European public rails rather than foreign infrastructure? Because that is, what a lot of the regulators and policymakers are looking for. Eurostack or what have you. Can we please build it on European technology? How do you see that? What would be your take? Maybe Samuel first.
Yeah, so I think there are 2 points to this. First, the liquidity cap. if we look at stable coins, they're mainly denominated in the dollar. So I think that EU it provides the framework under MiCA, but now needs to incentivize financial institutions to issue their stable coins back to euro, denominated in euro, so that we can have DeFi protocols and involving euro pairs. So that is, I think, the first point, if we have to look at digital sovereignty in the EU. And secondly, yes, the combination of the public infrastructure, so if we look at APSI, the European Blockchain Services Infrastructure, it would be a great idea to use the APSI decentralized identifiers coupled with the EU digital identity. And that could be great if they leverage those together. That would be something very concrete, which we can achieve in Europe.
All right, thank you. Jan, how do you see this?
We have a regulator who tries to regulate and interfere in the technology layer. And then we complained about sovereignty and technology that needs to be sovereign. I think that's a bit of a contradiction in terms, if you ask me, because I think ideally you would have a clear market and hope that there are some European players, but Belgian Air Force flies in air that circles around the globe, so I don't think you can limit the Belgian Air Force to just Belgian air. That's just not working. You'll have the same in Switzerland when you have a technology neutral regulation and the financial regulator called FINMA goes chain by chain and liberates them. I think we're 12 chains now that are regulated by now. So of course they're not all Swiss. But these chains, you have to think of that, it's like a closed island in a way. They have their own rules and workings. And I don't think it's a good idea to regulate technology just like the European Payments Initiative is not really taking off anywhere. They would like to replace or have an alternative to Visa and MasterCard, but somehow it got stuck halfway, and I'm afraid that the blockchain sovereignty discussion will be just about the same, because we focus too much on the regulation first rather than creating the context where a European player could become globally relevant.
All right, thank you. This panel is called Europe Quo Vadis, so let's have a little bit of an outlook. Where are we actually going? So to both of you, let's say 5 years from now, do you expect DeFi to be really absorbed into existing financial systems, or will it become a parallel reality, I wanted to say, a parallel financial infrastructure? And what role will Europe realistically play in that future? Samuel?
So it really depends on what the Commission is looking at, what the European Parliament will look at, and finally, the deciding factor, the European Council. So I believe it should be the way forward, but touching on what earlier was said, if we stifle technology in over-regulating technology, I think it's not a parallel or an integrated system, but we are going to leave, let's say, a whole industry out. So I believe we have to seriously think that when we discuss, when we opine, it's not only a statement of wishes, but it's actually an action plan.
Okay. Jan, how do you see this 5 years from now?
I have witnessed now the fintech industry evolving from its early days in the 2010 years until now. And what has happened in different waves. Let's take another example, Revolut. Revolut started really at the fringes, and I think today it's the biggest bank in Europe. And the same dynamic you will see with other elements that we've been discussing today on the stage. Which one is the first breakthrough? I'm not sure. Stablecoins maybe. Exchanges second. But the trend towards more digitization, towards more integration, towards more automation is coming. It's clear that the regulator tries to protect the existing financial service industry versus the newcomers. The newcomers tend to be not European players, either Asian or Americans. There are some locals, of course. So I think it's basically a geopolitical question. If Europe wants to play, it needs to really get serious about fostering an economy where growth can happen. And the more growth-oriented an economy is, the more integrated in 5 years DeFi will be in the financial sector. I mean, I can imagine a financial sector totally segregated from DeFi, and I can imagine a fully integrated version. And I think regulation should, in a wise way, ooze the DeFi into the established players, also force the established players to adopt some of the new technology eventually, just because the market will dictate that they're much more efficient, they're much more convenient to the consumer or to the users. So I think the openness to the economy and to growth, so maybe we should have economists next time on stage talking about this rather than lawyers and tax specialists and regulators. I think economists will tell you what model will survive. My observation of the last 15 years of fintech is that technology always wins if it's better than the past. And we've heard about romantic views of technologies of the past that they will not win. So if that is true, then I think we'll see a lot more DeFi in the financial service industry 5 years from now.
Jan, if this is also a geopolitical play and Europe is stuck between America and Asia, then should we actually be doing the same? Or you as an entrepreneur, what should be Europe's own, let's say, unique angle to this world and creating something that is really innovative and find its way, and also being able to export that to the rest of the world?
You know, first of all, you have to make it work, and you have to add value. It's always in an innovator's dilemma. Either you innovate early and you can shape the future of what you're trying to innovate in, or somebody else will dictate you the terms of the game in the future. And if Europe wants to continue to have a word and a say, it should be much more on the lookout for new trends and foster them rather than trying to hinder them. Just like we've seen with the AI Act. We could have the same discussion about AI that we had about crypto today. And almost all the votes will be very similar. Because Europe is not pushing the AI industry, it's trying to regulate it. So I think it's always that tendency of first regulate early that puts Europe in the binge, and with good intentions in many cases, because there are always risks. With any innovation there's risk, we have to accept that. But as an entrepreneur, you look at risk and you look at the risk and see, how can I manage it? It's not, risk, I'm shying away. Risk for an entrepreneur is opportunity. And I think that is something that needs to be rewarded in Europe and not punished.
Very clear message.
Yeah, I totally agree with Jan here. And maybe we should make a reference also to the Clarity Act. The Clarity Act, I believe Europe should look at it and in many ways try to emulate it as well. There's nothing wrong in trying to emulate a successful piece of legislation, which is not yet in force, but the aim is not, I believe, to stifle technology. We can regulate interaction, access, by which players, common rules, standard framework, but not stifle technology. And this is, I believe, of paramount importance if the EU wants to succeed and bank on being also the first large jurisdiction, if I have to say, the 27 plus 3 in the EEA, to have the MiCA. So if EU wants to stay at the forefront, you cannot stop.
All right. Looking at the audience, are there any questions from your side? Yes. I don't know, are there microphones, anyone, or did... All right.
More than a question, it's a bit of an observation. Earlier we were saying, like about regulating DeFi, et cetera, and MiCA. In terms of DeFi, I wonder, we keep hearing about outcomes-based regulation. And in my home jurisdiction, the MFSA actually states that this is its objective across the board. I think DeFi is the prime candidate. It is a situation where you don't really need to stifle the technology or growth or new initiatives, but you can have some outcomes that you would like to promote. And a good example can be found in another piece of EU legislation, which is GDPR. Like we gave people rights. We know how the outcome looks, but we didn't go and tell every single company out there, this is the way you have to achieve it. MiCA is uber prescriptive. I think, with the passage of time, MiCA itself will need to morph into something that is a bit more outcomes-based. However, DeFi still exists out there. It's experiencing a lot of uncertainty, and I think if, like the EU bodies got together and said, our approach to DeFi is going to be outcomes-based, more investment would go that way, and I think we would actually start tipping the balance back towards Europe. Because right now, innovation in DeFi is not happening in Europe, it's happening in America, and it's happening in the Middle East. And of course, Asia. That was my comment.
Thank you. So that was more a comment than a question, but I think a very good comment to end this panel with, because we're out of time. I think we go for coffee now, and we'll be back after the break, but not before we thank our panelists. Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you very much, Samuel.